South Africa, 1 year after Cyril Ramaphosa took over as president. And Zimbabwe, how is its president responding to recent protests that left several people dead? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. South Africa and Zimbabwe, two neighboring countries, are both facing challenges as their respective presidents respond. In Zimbabwe, protests last month sparked by fuel price increases resulted in a crackdown by security forces. At least 17 civilians were killed and hundreds injured. President Emmerson Mnangagwa said the protests were an attempt at what he said was regime change, helped by outside forces. He recently met with leaders of political parties and he's calling for dialogue to move his country forward. Meanwhile, in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa marks 1 year in office this month since being sworn in as president, following the resignation of Jacob Zuma. Since then, Ramaphosa has been battling issues such as high unemployment, corruption and land reform. In his recent State of the Nation address, he reminded South Africans of the challenges he faces.
A year ago, we set out on a path of growth and renewal, emerging from a period of uncertainty and a loss of confidence and trust. We resolved to break with all that divides us, to embrace all that unites us. We resolved to cure our country of the corrosive effects of corruption and to restore the integrity of our institutions.
We will talk about Zimbabwe later in the show, but we begin now with South Africa. Joining us from Johannesburg is journalist and news anchor Nhlanhla Sehume, and also joining us from Johannesburg is CGTN correspondent Angelo Coppola. Welcome to both of you to the show. Angelo, let me start with you. The South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, recently gave his State of the Nation address. What were the main themes or issues that he addressed in that speech?
Well, look, he spoke about policy certainty, and that was the big issue that was highlighted by him. He mentioned the fact that he had tackled it, and he used the minerals sector as an example of what had been done with Gwede Mantashe, the Minerals Resources Minister there, enacting the mining charter, a big hiccup or a big, should we call it, hurdle to getting people invested or interested in investing in the mining sector. So that charter was used as an example to tackle or to deal with the policy uncertainty issue. He also touched on education, mentioning the need for tablets for kids, for example. That was one of his other big pushes. He talked about privatization, which is one of the fundamental matters that are being dealt with at the moment. The ANC are saying they're not looking at privatization, while it seems that there might be parts of the ANC that are considering privatization. And here we were talking about Eskom and what was announced just recently in terms of splitting it up into 3 different parts. Then there was a discussion around the national health system and insurance and the need for an improvement in life standards for all South Africans and an increase in state capacity there in terms of the hospitals and clinics. So overall, we're talking about those major issues right now, Anand.
Angelo, you mentioned Eskom. That's South Africa's main electricity utility, and that's been a bit of a challenge for the country, hasn't it?
That's putting it mildly. In fact, the ratings agencies highlighted the issue there. Eskom sitting with a debt book of around $30 billion. That's around 400 million rand, or billion rand, and they don't know how to settle it. In fact, we've been told that Eskom can't even afford the interest on that payment. That's one side of the equation. So they're hoping to split it up and to somehow reduce that debt book. Nobody's quite sure how that's going to happen, because you're going to land up with 3 different types of top management tiers that sit in place and people moving across those different entities. So we're unlikely to see any cost cutting there.
In Nhlanhla, South Africans will go to the polls in national elections, and that will take place in May. Last month, the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, launched his party's campaign, his party being the African National Congress, the ANC. And in that speech, he emphasized the need to create jobs and fight unemployment. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
At the center of our manifesto is really a plan to create many more jobs and ensure that all workers can earn a decent living. We live in a country, by the broader definition, where over 9 million South Africans are unemployed.
So in Nhlanhla, unemployment clearly a very big issue in South Africa. In fact, during that State of the Nation address, Cyril Ramaphosa also said that above everything else, we must get our economy working. So in Nhlanhla, how big a challenge is the economy for the president, and can he create those jobs that he's talking about?
Well, the economy seems to be an albatross, not just around the president's neck, but also around the neck of the ruling party as it struggles to contend with high unemployment numbers. Just regarding stats that were released yesterday, or just in recent days rather, there is a revised figure regarding the unemployment rate in the country, which is staggeringly still high at 27.1%, slightly dropping from previous numbers, but still the ANC is really struggling to find ways of coming up with new and innovative ways to grow the country's economy and help to decrease the high unemployment numbers, especially among the country's youth. I mean, just quite interestingly, the leader of the EFF, Julius Malema, spoke in Parliament yesterday during the president's, a response to the president's State of the Nation address, basically accusing the president of plagiarizing some elements of the EFF's own policies, especially around issues of jobs and helping improve the country's education system. The president had announced that there will be a massive rollout of tablets which are going to be given to school children, especially in disadvantaged areas in the country. But the EFF then hitting back at the president and saying, what's the point of handing out or having these massive plans around tablets, which is, by the way, part of the EFF's manifesto campaign to say that tablets need to be given to the country's children, if you can't even solve issues such as sanitation, and where you have many children in the country still going to pit latrines or going to schools with pit latrines. So there are many issues that the ANC needs to resolve, but unemployment being highest among those issues at the moment and growing the country's economy.
Right, in Nhlanhla, and the EFF that you referred to is the Economic Freedom Fighters, one of the opposition political parties in South Africa, which is to the left in the political spectrum there. Angelo, one bit of positive news for the South African economy was the discovery by the French company Total of gas deposits off the South African coast. How much of an economic boost will that be for South Africa?
Now, before we get very excited, it is a massive find. It's going to take approximately 8 years before we'll see any kind of benefit as consumers in this country. So massive find, massive potential boost to attract potential investors into the country if the incentives are in place that government needs to put there to attract those very specialist businesses that need to operate in that value chain up and down, whether it's gas or oil. So big news. The state or the special economic zones will probably get a boost from this. Government has created these special economic zones to attract investors, and because they sit on the coast, they will probably work quite nicely with anything that comes out of those finds. Total have indicated that they're working on 4 other exploratory drilling sites at the moment, or will be in the very near future. So it's very likely that they have some other good news under their hats at the moment, Anand.
In Nhlanhla, of course, we've been talking about the economy. That will be one of the main challenges in that election that's coming up for the ANC as it tries to retain its majority. But how important will corruption be? That's featured very strongly in the South African debate.
Corruption is still a top agenda in South Africa, and the president has initiated the process of establishing a state of capture commission of inquiry. But quite interestingly, during his State of the Nation address, he also announced a reconfiguration of the country's intelligence agency and also the country's National Prosecutions Authority to kind of showcase, or rather show, his seriousness about tackling issues around corruption and fighting crime and getting those responsible for this corruption to be held to account and facing possible jail time. He also unveiled, or rather gave quite a big up, if I may say, to the country's new national prosecutions boss, also saying that, you know, this woman, or rather the person, Natasha Batohi, who assumes this position, comes with a lot of experience and is the one person who will not be influenced by politics in the country, and will rather take the National Prosecutions Authority forward and help fight corruption in the country. But still, issues, or rather sittings like the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, are still ongoing. But opposition parties are hitting back at the president, saying that how can we even take him seriously about his fight against corruption if people within his government, such as Minister Nomvula Mokunyane, who is now the Minister of Environmental Affairs, who has been implicated in issues such as state capture, has been implicated at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, having been said to have accepted a form of favor or bribes to an agency called Bosasa here in the country. So many questions are being raised as to how seriously is the president tackling the issue of corruption.
Angelo, what are your thoughts on the country's fight, on Cyril Ramaphosa's fight against corruption? I guess he faces the twin challenges, on the one hand, of trying to introduce good governance. He talked in that State of the Nation address about restoring the integrity of South Africa's institutions. So he wants to bring good governance to South Africa, but at the same time he needs to keep his party united and behind him, doesn't he?
Well, that's the issue. It's the united party front to try and keep those voters in place, and yet having to deal with one of the promises he made a year ago, which he hasn't really lived up to. The Zondo Commission, which is that State Capture Commission, has released some really damning allegations against two sitting ministers, Mokonyane, as was mentioned just now, and Mantashe. Both of them supposedly received security equipment at their homes, at their various homes, by a particular agency, and yet nothing has been said about those two ministers. And in terms of prosecutions, and this is the big thing that's probably going to be playing on voters' minds, there have been no major prosecutions of any people related to state capture. But interestingly, the day just before the President had his SONA address, it was announced that the National Prosecuting Authority had arrested 6 people in connection with bribery, corruption and money laundering allegations, just one day before the President's address. So some suggesting that there was a bit of politicking involved there to show that something is being done about corruption in South Africa.
All right, and Angelo, clearly the issue of corruption, the government's, or the ANC rather, is on the defensive on the allegations that they're facing right now. Is the opposition exploiting that ahead of the election?
They're politicians, and what do you think? Of course they're exploiting it. Every minute that there's no action taken by the government, the president or any other party members or cabinet ministers doing the right thing and resigning, is another opportunity for the DA, the EFF, that's the Democratic Alliance, or the Economic Freedom Fighters, or any of the other smaller parties, to make an announcement about how the government isn't doing anything about the fight against corruption or not taking it seriously enough. And they're obviously gathering some fodder for the election campaigning, which has already started. So yes, there is movement, it's politics, and we're coming up for an election on the 8th of May. So we're going to hear and see more of it, Anna.
In Nhlanhla, of course, the ANC is the dominant party in South Africa. It's one of the best-known parties in South Africa, the African National Congress. During the apartheid years, of course, it was the party of protest. In many instances, it led the struggle against apartheid. But how is it seen now, especially by the younger generation in South Africa?
Well, the younger generation is behaving very despondent to the policies that are being raised by the ANC, and many of the young people that I've spoken to speak of a disconnect between themselves and the ruling party. Some of them don't even know how to reach out to the ruling party, or maybe to reach to offices or branches of the ruling party to participate in regional or local politics and to get their inputs as to what their needs are. You see, so many young people feel like the ANC has let them down. They feel as though the ANC is not doing enough to help grow the country's economy, to help them get jobs, or to help create an environment that's conducive for them being employed. And the country's youth seems very despondent, and parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters are taking advantage of that. You see their presence has largely grown in a lot of university campuses in the country. You see leaders of the EFF going out on the ground and addressing students, which some feel is very opportunistic, but the party, or rather the Red Berets in the EFF, are at least speaking out or reaching out to the youth, which is something that's not seen to be done much by the ANC.
And in Nhlanhla, if that trend continues, if the ANC starts losing support, especially among younger South Africans, could we see that reflected in a change in the number of seats it has in Parliament?
Well, surely it will see the number of seats that the ANC holds in Parliament change, although many statistics that are being released recently show that President Cyril Ramaphosa stands a very good chance to win an overwhelming majority in the upcoming May 8 elections. But many may argue, and the EFF has said that, look, as much as they do take note of some of the research that's been coming out, which does indicate to a growing popularity for the incumbent President Cyril Ramaphosa, they say that the last elections proved something otherwise, where they weren't expected to reach the over 1 million vote mark in the country's elections, surprising many. So they are also promising surprises come the May 8 elections.
Angelo, one of the big issues which has been percolating constantly in post-apartheid South Africa is the land issue, the redistribution of land. It is a major issue. How is Cyril Ramaphosa addressing that? And can we see radical land reform in the years ahead?
Well, it's very interesting because it appears that Ramaphosa and the ANC are using land redistribution without compensation as a key political hook to try and get voters back into their fold, those that they lost in the municipal elections 2 years ago. And they're taking the approach quite seriously, and it seems to be a big angle that he has been hammering away at. In fact, what's happening at the moment, just yesterday, I believe, a committee was established to look at changing the constitution to amend Section 25 to allow for expropriation without compensation. So that's a fairly big step that's been announced. The issue really is that it's going to take some time to get through the parliamentary process, and we've got an election on the 8th of May, and it's unclear whether that process will go unchallenged in any kind of constitutional court action. We've heard from two different organizations that they will be challenging the move in court, but they want to see the nature of the change in the constitution or in the amended constitution first, and then they'll take legal action. And that legal action could carry on even when the regulations for the new act come into play. So it's very likely we're not going to see any movement on land redistribution anytime soon, unless, of course, it's forced through and the government needs to make some kind of a stand or public stand that they've expropriated a particular piece of land and handed it over to another party without any compensation. So it is unlikely to become a political or a election issue because of the timing of it. I know.
In Nhlanhla, of course, there have been challenging times for the government, for the ANC, since the end of apartheid. In fact, during his State of the Nation address, Cyril Ramaphosa seemed to acknowledge that. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
At times it has seemed like the milk of human kindness that allowed us to reconcile in 1994 had gone sour. But we will not surrender to the forces of pessimism and defeatism.
So, Nhlanhla, how much is South Africa changing, and what are the biggest challenges ahead for the president as he hopes to beat back these forces of pessimism and defeatism that he talks about?
Well, at the top of my mind, I can just recall some of the most pressing issues that are being raised by a lot of South Africans, especially previously disadvantaged South Africans or the black majority, issues around the big inequality that still exists in the country, especially economically. Issues around race relations as well, where we are seeing many incidents or racially charged incidents that are being reported on in the country, which gives you a sense that the country really still has a very long way to go. And that dream that came with the dawn of democracy, or that came with Tata Nelson Mandela's dream, seems to be a bit deferred right now, and where people are feeling, like I said earlier, feeling very, very despondent and feeling like this government has let them down and hasn't put their interests first.
We need to take a quick break. When we return, we will shift focus to South Africa's neighbor, Zimbabwe. A crackdown on recent protests there has resulted in several deaths. What's causing the unrest, and how is Zimbabwe's president responding? Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.